Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the Great Sea. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today I'm coming to you all with a video suggested to me by a subscriber going by WitchKing73. Thanks for the suggestion. Here are my thoughts on the top 5 biggest mysteries from the First Age, what they are, likely explanations and solutions to them, and their greater implications on the rest of the history of Middle-earth. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Our first mystery here is, how did Beleriand sink? How did that occur with everyone leaving it more or less? We know that after the War of Wrath and at the end of the First Age in 590, Western Middle-earth, a continent named Beleriand that made up much of the northwestern coast of Middle-earth looking off to the Sundering Seas towards the direction of Valinor, the whole land broke and was sundered due to the ruin that occurred during the war, and it sank beneath the sea. Now, I have heard of and contemplated many different possibilities as to why exactly this occurred, including that the land was just so scarred and utterly ruined and wrecked by the forces of war that it sank, or that in many ways it was scarred beyond repair, and the Valar, or Eru himself, drowned the land as a bit of mercy and to wrap up the Elder Days. So potentially it was just caused by its ruination, and that the land was unstable and fell beneath the sea, or that there was more divine intervention. Honestly, it's probably a mixture of all of that, as there were few remaining isles afterwards, such as Tol Morwen, Tol Himling, and Tol Fuin, the western isles that did remain. The first was a bit more symbolic, being the place of memory of Turin, Nienor, and their mother Morwen, ultimately the closest thing they had to a grave, with the others being higher geographical points from Beleriand, Himring, the hill, and parts of the Highland Forest, Tower Nu Fuin, or Dorthonion as well. Now I mention these as that I imagine some divine intervention must have taken place that kept Tol Morwen rising above the waters, while so many other places, including the very peaks of the encircling mountains around the ruin of Gondolin, sank beneath the waves. Since this one very important spot in the sorrows of the First Age did survive the drowning, I imagine that to be some sort of divine intervention on the behalf of this drowning of Beleriand. Another peculiar aspect of all of this is that it only really fell beneath the waves after all of its people departed, leading to the idea again of divine intervention, the same sort of intervention that would raise the Isle of Numenor above the waters further to the southwest of the former shores of Beleriand. All of this implies that it really was a divine act through the mercy for Beleriand after the war, and though the war had caused many scars upon the land, the Valar and Eru just ultimately believed it would be worth it to let Ulmo's domain wash over the scars caused by Morgoth's war. So we know Beleriand sank and the world changed, but what exactly remained and what exactly was destroyed, such as Nogrod, Belegost, Angband, Atumno, etc.? Now, I listed before some of those remaining islands, but there are other places such as those that I just mentioned here that are not wholly specified in their exact geographical locations on both the map of Beleriand and the map of Middle-earth that we know afterwards. It's all too easy to say, oh, they were all ruined and none of them survived onwards. However, apparently Nogrod and Belegost, even though they were utterly ruined in the War of Wrath, I'm not sure they also both sank into the sea. I think one of them, probably Nogrod, did fall into the Gulf of Lune, but Belegost, unless it was further west than I imagine, perhaps survived as a ruined dwarven city, which is absolutely fascinating to think about in the context of the later ages. Why, that we know of, did no dwarves return to rebuild it, or actually did they? We know Thorin's halls and those of his father Thrain were in the Blue Mountains, and perhaps they were made from the ruins of the ancient Naugrim city, of the Broadbeams and or Firebeards from the First Age, from Belegost. Or, if they didn't, were there any remnants or ruins of Belegost or Nogrod nearby? I'm not sure. There is a place in the Lord of the Rings Online called Sarnur, which were ancient dwarven ruins near Thorin's halls, that I believe are meant to harken back to Belegost or Nogrod. But what of those other places? Angband was probably destroyed and drowned with much of Beleriand. However, it is so far north and potentially east that could it have survived on one of the tail ends of Middle-earth? Or is its ruin actually right in front of us? Same with Atumno, which was east of Angband. I've heard this idea that perhaps the cold of the north in Eriador, was a legacy of Melkor, whose wounds upon the world ended the spring of Arda many ages before, and the cold of the north might be a legacy of that ruination. For instance, could it be that the Ice Bay of Forokel was actually where Angband or Autumno was? I'm not exactly sure. Perhaps none of these places did survive the collapse and they all drowned into the sea, but again, the implications on how exactly some of Beleriand lined up with Middle-earth have always been somewhat of a mystery. One we can guess at, but never be sure of. Of course, there are maps of Beleriand and Middle-earth lining up, and there are parts that we know do connect, but where exactly Angband is with regards to the Shire, for instance, I'm not exactly sure. So it is possible that, with however Beleriand exactly drowned, that they might have remained in Middle-earth. I find it fascinating, and we'll end this point on the question of, if we were to dive down to the ruins of Beleriand in the sea, what do you think we could find? The halls of Menegroth preserved by the cold waters? The ruined underwater volcanoes that were once the Thangorodrim? Our next mystery here is what happened to other evil creatures? Ungoliant, escapee Balrogs and dragons, etc. Turning our attention away from geography to characters for this one, we know that there were only so many Balrogs, dragons, and so forth in Middle-earth, and with Durin's Bane and Smaug emerging later in the Third Age, some survived the First Age by fleeing. But who exactly survived? Where did they go, and what exactly befell them in the end? Many of us guess that Ungoliant eventually devoured herself, but before that might have happened, if it ever did she come to terrorize another part of Middle-earth? Where did she go? What did it look like seeing that thing that devoured the light and dews of the trees of Valinor running over Middle-earth, scurrying with darkness and unlight, leaving her offspring in her wake? How many Balrogs actually survived the War of Wrath? Perhaps it was just the one, perhaps it was more. Was Smaug one of the dragons flying around during Encalagon's battle with Eärendil that smashed the Thangorodrim? Or was he an offspring of even greater dragons to the north, who survived that war? Who knows, but the implications for other dangerous creatures in other parts of Middle-earth are very, very interesting indeed. Speaking of combative creatures, who exactly defeated Morgoth? I've heard conflicting ideas that the War of Wrath was really fought by the Noldor of Finarfin that stayed behind, the Vanyar of King Ingwe, and the Maiar, such as Manwë's herald Eonwë, but not actually the Valar themselves. It could be that the Valar did come to Middle-earth after Eärendil's plea to them for aid. It's absolutely possible, and honestly that's a bit of the assumption with how Morgoth was defeated, but we don't actually know if the Valar ever came to Beleriand during the War of Wrath. Sure, Morgoth was cut down, bound with Engainor the chain, and his iron crown was beaten into a collar for him. And that seems totally like something only a Vala could do to him, or multiple Valar. But then it also seems like the Valar coming to Beleriand, fighting side by side with men and elves and so forth, seems a little bit strange with the boundaries of lore and Iru's rules in the canon, because men couldn't step foot in Valinor, but all of a sudden they're fighting side by side with the Valar, the gods themselves. It's strange. Now, for me, I like to think that only a few, or only Tolkas, actually joined the war for that reason. There needed to be someone strong enough to actually take on Melkor or Morgoth in physical combat, because even some of the greatest elves, such as Fingolfin, could not. The wider implications here are, for instance, when Elrond recalled seeing the banners of the elves of the First Age in wartime, and spoke about this during The Lord of the Rings, what exactly did he and so many others see? Did they see Manwë summoning the winds and Ulmo using floods and so forth? Or did he see far less of a magical type of experience, of a godly experience, giant armies clashing in the attempt to take down Morgoth in the end? What stories sprouted from those who saw all of this during the war? And how would all of that change things? For the final one we're discussing today, at least, it might actually be my favorite on this list. Where did Maglor go? Of all the mysteries on this list, this is surely the most specific and smallest in scale, but of all the sons of Feanor, only one explicitly survived the First Age, Maglor, the second oldest son. After throwing his Silmaril into the sea, it is said that he wandered the shores of the world, singing laments of his sorrow and regrets. Perhaps he eventually was taken by the sea, or perhaps he eventually went back to Valinor and repented. Or perhaps he did not. This is interesting on such a micro scale, and it could be that he impacted stories, peoples, and cultures for ages to come. Or perhaps he was simply an observer from the Elder Days. Or maybe he eventually re-engaged with the world, even under a new name. There are so many different possibilities with this character and his future. Did he encounter Númenóreans? Did he witness the death of Amroth and see Nimrodel afterwards, as that happened in the Bay of Belfalas? Did he witness the Oathbreakers come to Pelargir under the command of Aragorn? Did Maglor see the ship of Frodo the Ringbearer and others sail into the west from the Grey Havens? Or did he go so far afield that he became influential in other lands that we never hear about? I have no idea, but this idea of Maglor wandering Middle-earth's shores has always fascinated me. Part of me hopes that if Tolkien had written The New Shadow, his Fourth Age sequel to The Lord of the Rings, Maglor would have come into play as not only one of the last elves left in Middle-earth, but the last High Elf from the Elder Days left. All of these mysteries are very interesting to me, and though we will never have answers, most likely, for any of them, I find thinking about what might have come of all these ideas to be just interesting and expansive to the lore. Royan and I were talking on our Patreon podcast yesterday, as of the recording of this video, about the idea of adaptations filling in gaps where there is no other currently existing lore, with stories that feel Tolkienian. These are some of those potential gaps that could be filled in by stories that come through adaptations. And I think that even though these are First Age ideas, and adaptations might not have the rights to them, of course, I do really like the idea that we could further explore these mysteries in games, shows, and movies, like so many of the mysteries in Middle-earth, which I made a different video about. How cool would it be to see another dragon that had escaped the battle between Eärendil and Celegon pop up in another adaptation, or to see Maglor come into some strange small part of a game that took place during The Lord of the Rings. So long as it makes sense, and so long as it adds something to the story and is a well-told story itself, I don't really have a problem with it. I find it to be quite interesting. So what do you all think about these mysteries? Were there any I didn't touch on from the First Age? Let me know in the comments below. So, my friends, we come to the end of our tale. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some What It United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout. Please check out our merch and Patreon. Also, please give Zwood a look and their wood-carved maps and clocks, and use the code in the description for 15% off at checkout. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, John Hume, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Andrew Carlisle, and Zumi. Thank you so much to all of our patrons for making this possible. It means a lot. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on what the Lord of the Rings was like from the perspective of the Lord of the Rings himself, Sauron. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.